Good afternoon, and welcome to this session of the 7th Annual Nantucket Book Festival. I'm Dick Burns, a member of the committee, and on behalf of the committee and all of those who have worked on the festival preparations, I want to thank you so much for coming. It's certainly been gratifying to see the audiences that we've had this morning. And this festival is all for you, so keep that in mind. We wouldn't be doing this if you didn't show up in numbers, and the increase this year is just very heartening. Thank you. I want also to thank our sponsors, our main sponsors, the Nantucket Athenaeum and the White Elephant, and other sponsors whose names, sponsors and donors whose names appear in the program. I hope you'll look at those names and realize that along with you, they are supporters of this endeavor, and without you and without them, we would be a non-existent entity. I also want to say that the role played by sponsors and donors allows us to make this an essentially free event, with the exception of a couple of events. And that's something that's dear to our hearts and something that we want to continue in the future. James, after his presentation, will be signing books over here in this alcove. Books are for sale over there. And at this time, if you could turn off your mobile phones, that would be wonderful. James Woods has become a household name among book people. He's been one of the foremost critics in the English language for some time now. He's done stints at The Guardian, The New Republic, and currently he's professor of the practice of literary criticism at Harvard and a frequent contributor to The New Yorker and other publications. He's primarily a critic, but he has written fiction, and he's here today with his new book, Upstate. It's probable, I think, that there's a coterie of James Woods readers who know him primarily as a critic and are probably approaching this new work on the outlook for his approach to his subject and evidence of the toolkit of fiction writers that he describes so well in How Fiction Works. But if they embark on that mission, they'll soon abandon it a few pages into Upstate, because that book is captivating, and the characters and the settings are really so enriching that you'd be hard pressed to keep looking for bits and pieces of those touches. I'd say the main thrust of the book is the attempt of a father and one of his daughters to assess what seems to be a crisis in his second daughter's life, and that story is a rich ground for all sorts of philosophical questioning and just captivating interaction of the characters. This life of the book and the life of the characters is something that you may not expect from a critic. But had you read his earlier novel, and had you read his essays, you would probably be prepared for this. And I'm thinking right now, particularly of one great essay on John Jeremiah Sullivan, himself a brilliant young essayist, in which James has compared John Jeremiah Sullivan to David Foster Wallace. And at one point, he says that David Foster Wallace's compassionate sensitivity was often blocked by his obsessive self-consciousness, and when not blocked, sometimes emerged as an outright sentimentality. And when I read that some years ago when it first appeared, that essay, I thought, this guy wrote a book of fiction, and I need to read his fiction, because this is the kind of fineness of observation that I like. It's these gifts of style and sensibility enliven Upstate. Would you please welcome James Wood?
Thank you very much, Dick. That was an extremely warm introduction. As Dick suggested or hinted, the book deals with familial relations and questions of happiness and unhappiness, of interest to us all, I'm sure, and of acute interest to not a few people in this room, including me. I suppose the book comes out of thinking about the dilemma of happiness and unhappiness. Look at any family, in particular at any group of siblings, and invariably you find an apparently arbitrary and unjust distribution of happiness and unhappiness. Why is she confident and buoyant while he struggles to stay afloat? Growing up, I was conscious of this dappled distribution. My mother was depressive, and her mother had had some kind of nervous breakdown in the 1930s. All we knew in family law was that she'd had electroconvulsive therapy, at that time quite fashionable. All my mother's emotions were transparent, vigorous, worn on her sleeve, both the joy and the anger and the unhappiness. My father, by contrast, was enigmatically even-keeled, shall we say. He seemed neither to be passionately happy nor passionately unhappy. Perhaps not such a bad way to be, although if you'd asked me at the age of 10, I wouldn't have agreed with that. I was a lucky middle child, sandwiched between two buffers, an older brother and a younger sister, who seemed to absorb many more shocks than I did. And when I say absorb, I mean to actually take them, and not always successfully absorb them, but to be the recipients more often than I was, perhaps in the middle. And I've always thought of my disposition as fairly optimistic, sunny, fairly confident. Both order seems important in this respect, but certain gifts and talents, intelligence, musical or athletic aptitude, would seem to be genetically bestowed. By the way, I'm talking in the presence of a rather distinguished expert on these matters, who's written a very important and wonderful book. So I'm trying to tread carefully as a layman. Might this be the case with happiness? It seems difficult to learn happiness, as you might pick up the piano or French. And perhaps I reveal here my rather English distrust of the salvation of therapy. It's a rather terrifying idea, perhaps, but what if we are born with a kind of fixed reservoir of happiness, our allotted quota, which we can do little to affect? These reflections and anxieties become all the more acute, of course, if you're a parent. Perhaps the essence of parenthood is learning how little you can change or control. Of course, a parent profoundly determines all kinds of elements in a child's life, and I'm not discounting the importance of a loving home, an intact family, money, schooling, even food. But many of us know what it's like to become gradually aware of all the things we seem to have little control of as parents. And what if happiness were one of them? The ability to be happy is so appallingly determinative. Fortunately, as Chekhov put it, literature's task isn't to answer questions, it's to raise them. This, by the way, is why literary criticism is somewhat easier than physics. And maybe even writing fiction is easier than physics, I don't know. And that's the spirit of my novel, Upstate, to dramatize rather than answer such questions from the point of view of an Englishman called Alan Querry. Alan is a 68-year-old property developer, a self-made man from the north of England, educated and intelligent, but not greatly self-reflective, and not an intellectual. Alan has two grown-up daughters who are very different from each other. The elder one, Vanessa, 40 years old, has been troubled by sadness and uncertainty for much of her life, certainly since the moment when, as a teenager, she witnessed her parents' divorce. Vanessa has spent much of her adult life in the States and lives in Saratoga Springs, where she teaches philosophy. I like the irony of someone whose profession is to reflect on such life questions as happiness or human flourishing, being practically ill-equipped in her real non-reading life. Vanessa's younger sister, Helen, is fairly naturally confident and vital. She works as a music producer in London. Their father, as I said, is a doer, not a thinker, and in many ways is poorly equipped to answer Vanessa's spiritual needs. The book takes place over 6 days in February 2007, midwinter in upstate New York. Helen and Alan travel from England to Saratoga Springs when Vanessa's new boyfriend, Josh, sends them an email in which he confides his anxiety about Vanessa's mental health. Vanessa, who had seemed to be doing much better, whose life had seemed to be immeasurably improved by the arrival of Josh, just a few months earlier seems to have fallen into a deep crisis. What precipitated it? And when Josh hints that she might have tried to do herself some harm, that she might have thrown herself down a flight of stairs, is he being shrewd or melodramatic? And is Josh a keeper or not? Is he the one? Alan and Helen feel they need to find all this out. And I'm just going to read from the beginning of the book. Before they get to America, actually, Alan goes to visit his extremely aged mum, who's in her early 90s, to tell her that he is going to America for a week, where he's been only once before. But in that English way, he can't actually tell his mother why he's going. I mean, he thinks he will, but he ends up not doing so. First, he would have to go and see his mother. He would tell her something about Vanessa, not everything, of course. The home, 6 miles along a favorite road, was a formidable old place with that gray strictness of the north he loved. But now it looked abandoned. Everything was in wintry abeyance. 4 years she'd been living there, and he was still never sure how to announce himself. It was also ridiculously expensive. He could no longer afford it. What did he get for the money? 2 small rooms rather than one, extra space for the dark massing of a lifetime's heavy old furniture. And maybe she got 2 biscuits with her tea on Fridays. He made his way through 2 huffing fire doors, which bottled a weekend's stale yeast. School food. Outside his mother's room, Clarendon, he gathered himself a bit like a clown, pulling up his trousers, dusting down his coat, and entered with a light knock. The television was off, thank goodness. She was asleep in the chintz chair his father had used as the family throne, issuing directives and decrees from behind his newspaper. She was tiny, sunken. Some of her teeth were out. The old music hall joke. Her teeth are like stars, they come out at night. But it was early afternoon, As she breathed, something seemed to catch in her throat. She'd always had a large nose, and now she seemed to be reducing around it, shrinking down to bone, the nose tenacious, final, root-like. She opened her eyes and said with slight affront, "When did you get here, Alan?" As if he'd been spying on her. "Just a second ago." "Fetch me my teeth, by the side of the bed, please, in the glass." She turned away from him to insert the plate. "Now, we need to call for some tea and biscuits. They'll bring it if you ask." As a child in a lower middle-class suburb of Edinburgh, she had made herself unpopular at school by affecting an English or maybe Anglo-Scots pronunciation. Since his dad's death, her accent seemed to have moved up the ranks again by another notch or two. It usually had the effect of making her sound slightly irritable. In truth, these days she sounded like the mistress, but looked more like the servant, short, bent, too modestly or shabbily dressed today. "You don't need to wear this shawl thing, do you?" he said, lifting it over her shoulders. "Certainly not. I just put it on for my nap. Thank you. You look very tired. You know, you can't burn your candle at both ends. A Roman candle, maybe?" He just had his 68th birthday. "How are you?" "All right, I suppose, but this English view isn't my landscape, of course," she added, gesturing at the window with splendid authority. "Well, it's not a bad one," he said, looking at the line of leafless trees and the icy hills. He was paying for that English view. "And we've been over this. You don't want to live with me, you need your independence, though it would be a lot cheaper if you did move in with us." "Absolutely not. I took in your grandmother, as you perfectly well know, and it made my 50s a complete blank. All I did day after day was look after her. I'll never do that to you." In that house, the two women had seemed to detest each other. With stealthy expertise, each made the other immovably depressed. "But you want me to visit, and I want to visit you." He took her hand. "You're no good to me 3 hours away up in Scotland, even though you'd have your own landscape there." He said it gently. The tea arrived, carried by a very red teenage boy. He offered a biscuit to both of them and then left, making sure to take the full plate with him. "Wartime rations round here," said his mother. The young man appeared again. "Mrs. Querry," he said, "I'm supposed to remind you that the residents are gathering at 3:30 in the Sun Lounge for the winter flu vaccination. It's, the booster for them that missed it first time round. Need any help?" "No, I have my son. Thank you." The room could have been a lot worse. High ceilings with ornate moldings, Roman laurels almost, textured wallpaper with chips in it like slivered almonds, though in fact these always made him think of splinters caught under a child's skin. All painted a pleasant cream. And parental things he'd known all his life. A reproduction watercolor of Durham Cathedral, an antique mirror that you couldn't really see yourself in. It looked valuable, but he knew it wasn't. A cushion whose faded lilac cover, bought by him at Heels, London, on the Tottenham Court Road, had not been replaced in 30 years at least. It was all pretty good, or as good as can be when one's whole life has been reduced to souvenirs of selfhood. It was a nice place, but he couldn't afford it any longer. She looked at him with her pale blue eyes. Vanessa's. "This whole place is up in arms. My next-door neighbor lost her hearing aid yesterday. She put it in some tissue paper on her bedside table, and the cleaner threw it out by mistake. She thought it was a bit of rubbish. And in the room that's just 2 doors down the hall, Mary Binet is furious because she likes to talk French to another woman here who can understand it. She's the only woman who can. And now Mary's been told to stop talking French by the staff. Apparently someone else, we all assume it's one of the residents, and I have a very good idea who, has complained that they're speaking a secret language to exclude everyone else. I'll miss it. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I liked hearing the French. And now the manager is leaving at the end of the month. She's only been here for 6 months. She's Czech, I think, a nice woman, though for some reason she hates to be thought of as Polish." He interrupted her. "Ma, I have to go to America for a week." "America? Well, well. On business?" She'd always enjoyed enunciating those words, so he spoke them back to her with finality. "On business." "Well, don't get caught up in anything." "Caught up in anything?" "It's a dangerous place, from what I hear. There was that terrible thing with the towers. You'll go and see Vanessa? She always wanted you to visit her in that place, in Saratoga Springs." "Yes, I wanted to say sarsaparilla." "I will see her. And Josh." "Oh, good Lord. Courage there. He's far too young and certainly not good enough for her." "You've never even met him." "Well, that's 2 of us, but I do have a telephone here, you know. I get reports." And I was about to say, before you interrupted me, that Vanessa isn't getting any younger, is she? "Ma, I can't keep up with you. Now you're giving him your blessing." "Well, why shouldn't the poor thing have a boyfriend? Maybe Josh is the one. And when they marry, you'll blame him for taking Vanessa away." "Oh, Vanessa was already away, well away. She did her PhD there, not here, after all. That was the beginning. Silly girl. It was a shame she couldn't come back at Christmas. I suppose she'd rather spend time with her beau." There was a moment or two of old-fashioned silence. The tick of his mother's fancy carriage clock, his gift. "Alan, love, can you help me to the sunroom? I want to get there early, while the needle is still sharp." They smiled at each other, and he helped her up and went beside her as she gripped the mouse-gray tubular walker, a marvel of engineering, as strong as a weightlifter, but as light as the bones of a very old lady, with wheels on the front and 2 splayed yellow tennis balls stuck on the back legs. These dragged along the carpet as the aged couple, mother and son, moved slowly down the corridor. So Alan meets his younger daughter, Helen, in New York City, and the two take that wonderful train journey up the Hudson, majestic to all of us, Americans or not, to Albany, and then on to Saratoga Springs to spend a few days with Vanessa. Alan's visit to Saratoga Springs allows me to explore the other subject of the novel, one also close to my heart: how America looks to non-American eyes. I've lived in the States for a long time, since 1995, and I have American children, but I'm still aware of a certain doubleness in my vision, a mild estrangement which can be quite useful for a writer. I was 30 years old when I came here, so I was decisively formed by my Englishness. As I said, Alan briefly visited America 21 years before, but only to New York City. And really, it's all new to him. That train journey up the Hudson, the intense, caustic cold of an American winter, so shocking to those of us from a temperate island. The tribal politics of upstate New York. This is 2007, but it was acute then, of course, even before the Trump era. And certain similarities strike him between the landscape around Saratoga Springs and the landscape he grew up in. He grew up in the north of England, Newcastle and Durham. Durham is a university town with a cathedral in it, surrounded by now defunct coal fields. Newcastle built its prosperity on coal and steel, shipbuilding in particular, and has watched that prosperity disappear. Saratoga Springs, for those of you who know it, is an extremely attractive college town, a college town and a vacation resort, a spa from the 19th century. But if you go 30 miles south of Saratoga Springs, you get to the city of Troy, which is not unlike the city of Newcastle. Massive prosperity in the 19th century built on steel, the biggest city in America in terms of its steel money, and has watched that disappear too. So when Alan starts traveling around a bit, as he does, he actually makes a visit to Troy, he shouldn't be surprised, but he is surprised to find these similarities between his childhood landscape and the one he's visiting in upstate New York. More than that, I wanted to take someone who has complacently rested on a fairly standard issue, reflexive European anti-Americanism, and gradually expose him to an American otherness which at first simply alienates and then intrigues and even delights. I was probably here using my parents as models. They weren't anti-American, probably the opposite, in fact, but they'd never been here when I left in 1995, when I left the UK to come to the States. So I might as well have gone to the moon. I was very aware when I spoke to them on the phone, I was living in Washington, D.C. for the first few years of our life in the States, that I was just really giving them a list of ungrounded names when I gave them my news. Adams Morgan, New Republic, a trip up to Somerville, even a trip to Manhattan. It didn't really mean very much to them. Had they ever actually seen a copy of the New Republic or even a copy of the New Yorker? I don't think so, unless I showed them one. My life only existed for them when I was in their presence, and ideally in their presence back home in the UK. I wanted to explore something similar in my novel. As Alan warms to America, so he gradually warms to the reality of his daughter's American life. And here are two short passages that deal with that slow apprehension of Americanness. Here is Alan on the train with Helen as it goes up the Hudson River. When had he last sat next to Helen on a train? No one had that kind of time anymore. And America was peculiar, more foreign than he had expected. It sharpened his senses. What a contradictory place. For every limitation, there was an expansion. For every frustration, an easement. The train was absurd, trundling along at barely 60 miles an hour. And Penn Station was a bloody embarrassment to a great capital city. To a great city, rather. But this journey was extraordinary. It had a pioneer feel. The enormous Hudson with chunks of ice like broken pavement in the water, and the huge, wealthy forests, the valley full of forts and power stations and opportunistic houses glooming on vast icy bluffs, the railway stations more like adventurers' huts than anything in Europe, barely manned outposts without proper platforms and outlandish names, Poughkeepsie, Yonkers, Schenectady. The train high above the ground, the big wheels polishing the rails, and the driver blowing that childishly dissonant horn. Why did he blow it so often? Maybe because he enjoyed it so much. Perhaps that childish harmonica sound, the crushed klaxon peal, reminded him of being a boy again, reminded him of Christmas Day, of blowing a spitty mouth organ fresh from the box. But then at other times, it sounded less like a harmonica than an animal's long cry from the prairie. And that sound, the big, easy loiter of it, was America for him. Though he couldn't say what America was, except that sound. He would, at the very least, see the kind of life Vanessa lived in the States, her American life. I do dearly love American train horns. I guess we all love American train horns, but I get to be slightly alienated from them, right? When I hear one over the reservoir in Cambridge at 1 in the morning, I can at least feel that it is not a native sound, whatever that might be. This morning and last night, the fantastic boat sound from, I don't know what that is, someone will tell me what it is, but it is absolutely magnificent and so long, it's just, I've never heard that in England. It's a beautiful sound. This is a little later in the novel. Alan has taken his daughter's Toyota Prius and has decided to drive around a little bit outside Saratoga Springs to see what's going on outside the town. And since he's in a college town, naturally there are a lot of Toyota Priuses around, which means that he falls in behind another Toyota Prius. Very Cambridge, that. He drove down Broadway. That's the main street in Saratoga Springs, a very handsome, wide main street. He drove down Broadway, past the fabulous Alexandria Hotel, past the fine buildings, and slowly out of town. All the better if he could get off the main road, into the fields and back lanes, where the life is. You drive on the bloody right here, he said to himself. Links fahren, tenez la gauche. No, that's Dover coming back from France. A little nervously, he fell behind a line of cars. Another Prius was directly in front of him, bright purple, its rear gummed with stickers, like a student's rucksack. At least the war against global warming is going well. The rapture is not an exit strategy. W stands for war. I'm already against the next war. It was exhausting in the way of Josh's T-shirts, though he was smiling. When the tattooed Prius turned left off the main road, he did the same, slowing down to adjust to the smaller road. He was passing bare, wintry fields and was in farming country, or so it seemed. A church-like barn, silvery silos standing upright like missiles, a quad bike with a trailer. The road had no verge. A foolhardy pedestrian would have to make do with a grassy ditch. But the countryside never stopped being urban. A big modern high school came and went, go Knights. There were petrol stations and some kind of veterans hall, chicken dinner Monday. A beaten-up Ford pickup truck for sale, 92,000 miles, parked in the middle of a vast, clean, snowy front lawn like one of those brutal modern poems, self-consciously surrounded by a lot of white page. An unconvincing motel, tiny, low wooden cabins, somewhat resembling veal hutches, that seemed likely to have closed in 1957, but which still have advertised vacancies. A shack whose hanging sign offered geeks help for computer problems, only connect, the business was called. For miles and miles, so it seemed, the spoiled, enterprising landscape persisted, or subsisted, thought Alan, for it was clear enough that outside Saratoga life was extremely difficult, hard, austerely poor in a way that strongly reminded him of northeast England and his childhood. How he and his parents wore everything out to extinction. How he and Mam walked everywhere, those smoky Newcastle streets. Before they moved to Durham and moved up in the world, Mum pretended to the fancy neighbors at the end of the street in the big corner house that they ate meat at least 3 times a week for dinner. The old dirty laundry smell of boiled cabbage. To this day, he refused to eat cabbage, refused to buy it. And yet he liked what he saw here. It was distinct. Everything had sharp outlines. The shock of its difference had its own kind of strong pewter taste. Above all, warming to the reality of Vanessa's American life means coming to terms with the adultness of his daughter. I don't have grown-up children yet. They're 16 and 14. But they're old enough that I'm beginning to ponder the paradox ahead of how my children will remain my children and thus eternally young, while at the same time must become adults and thus importantly not my children anymore, not young, but independent, separate. Alan has always let Vanessa come to him, but when she does this, she reverts, structurally, you might say, to being a child, his child. Now he comes to her, and while he remains her father, he must alter his regard so that she is no longer his child, but an adult. And I'll just close with a single page that I think catches, I hope, some of that. He's at the first dinner in Saratoga Springs with Vanessa, and he's trying to get the measure of her and hearing about her newish boyfriend, Josh. The dinner was proving uneventful, thought Alan. It was wrong to think of it like that, of course. Vanessa had spent a good deal of the evening talking to them about Josh. She had met him 8 months ago at a conference in Boston on technology and consciousness. Vanessa was delivering a paper. Josh was poking around to see if there was something to write a piece about. He was only 33, 7 years younger than her, but had lived a few lives already, according to Vanessa's account. He started and abandoned a PhD at Columbia, taught briefly in a poor Brooklyn high school, wrote an unpublished novel on his mother's old Corona for the beatnik hell of it, and was now figuring out what's next, while earning a decent income, writing pieces about technology and innovation for magazines like Wired and Rolling Stone. To Alan, this sounded like a handful of snipped threads and no pattern. It didn't matter how brilliant he was. Van said that he was the brightest person she'd ever met, if he didn't stick at anything. And Alan had other thoughts. It can't possibly be true about his earning a decent salary from freelance journalism. She's keeping him. As the financial benefactor, Van has the upper hand. But as the younger man, Josh has the upper hand. A bloke who won't stick at a job won't stick at a relationship. And how she loved him. That much was obvious. When Vanessa spoke about Josh, she was shy and alert at once, a beautiful combination. She sat up straight and perched on the edge of her seat and stopped eating. There was a beautiful cherry tree in the garden in Northumberland. In the spring, it shed so much blossom that the air around it seemed to be charged with pink activity. When they were small, the children would climb onto the lower branches and jump off into that rouged carpet. The little kid-glove petals clung to their clothes when they stood up. Each time they jumped, even though he knew it was safe, even though he had been 1,000 times more reckless when he was a boy. Alan and his best friend William used to race their brakeless bikes down Western Hill. He tensed himself, prepared for disaster. Sentimental of him and certainly not very useful. Imagine if his own parents had been as soft and anxious. Still, he wanted that carpet of blossom to stay forever on the grass. He wanted his children only to jump from the lower branches. To see them grow older was to realize that they would only climb higher and higher, and that all he could do was silently watch as they jumped. Thank you. I'm very happy to take questions. We probably don't have a lot of time for questions, but I'm happy to take whatever you throw at me. Or if not, I will interview myself. No, right, yeah. Yes, it is. The question was, is it daunting to go from being a critic to a novelist? In one respect, it isn't, of course, and I'll explain that in a second. It's daunting because, as anyone who does creative writing knows, there's a lot can't be planned. You might know exactly how the book is going to begin and how the book's going to end, as I did. And still, in the nature of things, when a scene is to be described, a good portion of that scene will be something that you haven't yet discovered yet and is discovered in the act of writing. And I think that feels different from writing what I mainly do, which is book reviews, which are temporarily discreet compared to, I mean, remember poor old Henry James would always start a short story and then be surprised that it was, I meant this to be 30 pages, but whoops, I've written, The Portrait of a Lady. It got out of hand, sort of thing. That's in the nature, I think, isn't it, of open-ended writing, temporally open-ended and formally open-ended. Whereas when I write a review, even if it's a sort of 5,000-word piece, it has to be finished fairly quickly, and then I'm writing it and then into that structure come a number of other known quantities. I'm writing it directly for an editor who will see it, in 3 days' time. I will then get a week later, a proof back, and then a week after that, let's say, it appears in a magazine with a known audience, even albeit invisible, but a sort of known quantity. Everything, of course, is different when you're writing something over many months or several years for an audience that you can't really envisage and perhaps shouldn't, I think. That would be the main difference, is that you shouldn't, I think, be thinking about audience, whereas I think it's in the nature of journalism that you're locked into that relationship with an audience. In other ways, of course, it isn't daunting, because I spend all my time thinking about fiction and being inside fiction and writing about fiction, and in that sense, living vicariously. I mean, I think it's an important thing that a critic does anyway, is live that fictional experience vicariously for the reader, who then uses it to swim into the book. And I think in the secret of that vicariousness, if it's done right, is a fundamental creativity. In that sense, I didn't feel. I mean, what's that nice Updike thing about hugging the shore? That book of reviews and essays, mainly from the New Yorker, that he published in the 1980s. I didn't ever feel I was too far from the shore in that regard. Yeah. Perfectly good question. I live with a novelist, Claire Massoud, and the question was, do I have I like the word input. That would be a little alarming. Though, what sort of effect or input do we have on each other's writing? Well, the important thing is, and here's where it's, I don't think it's an unalloyed happiness or efficiency necessarily to have two writers living together in the same house. There can be certain elements of competition, elements of distribution of time. I mean, those of you who write books will know that it's a little different from necessarily from going out to do a job. It's not necessarily more involving than someone who's very driven at work. And indeed, in my novel, I mean, Alan has built a company, and part of something that he has to reflect on in relation to his two daughters is that perhaps that building of a company came at the cost of being alert to his daughters' happiness. But still, writing a book is a somewhat how shall I? It's very involving, and the ego swells, rather, should we say? It can be somewhat narcissistic activity. You come down from the study or in from the office or wherever and all you want to do is talk about what you're doing, and that can be problematic if the other person also wants to talk to you about what she's doing, right? And enough about your novel. What about mine? So actually, it works out. If we look back, I don't think we ever planned this, but we noticed after a while that we were beginning to follow a pattern, which is that while she was working on a book, I wouldn't be, and then while I was working on a book, she wouldn't be, and so on. But in terms of input, we do read each other's work, and she was very helpful to me when I got to the end of this book, because she brought a writer's eye to it and noticed certain narrative strands that she felt I'd lopped off too soon and that needed to be dragged right out to the end, particularly because it's quite a short novel and has, in some ways, the form of a short story, and therefore form is important. So she was very helpful to me, yeah. Yeah, perhaps this should be the last one, I think. Yeah. Sure. So this is a question of how I got the idea for the story. For a long time I wrote this, I was thinking the plot through in my head before I wrote it. And it doesn't have much of a plot anyway. Indeed, the negative reviews I've received so far, alas, I have to tell you, this is the appalling prescience we have. One coming up in the Times Book Review. The negative reviews that I've received have tended to say nothing happens in the book. And here, I think you will be amused. I took my kids when they were quite a bit younger, probably about 6 or 7 years ago, to Saratoga Springs for the weekend because I wanted to just walk around a bit, take some notes and so on. And I said, so I'm thinking of writing something. I hadn't written anything at that point, but I said, I'm thinking of writing this story that I've wanted to tell for some time about a father and two daughters, and one of them lives in Saratoga Springs. And there's something like a family reunion. And I said, I know exactly what will happen up to the point that they get together in Saratoga Springs, but there it gets a little vague. And I said to my kids, what should the story be? And my daughter said, it's very simple. Alan should get very sick and die. And at the funeral, which will be necessarily held in upstate New York, the two sisters who've been estranged for 15 years tearfully reunite. And I said to my daughter, I don't really like novels like that. I sort of like novels where not much happens. And she looked at me, sort of rolled her eyes, and well, it turned out I wrote the novel in which nothing much happens. So the negative reviews have tended to accuse me of that, and perhaps not without some justice, or shall I say, somewhat ruefully. I've been thinking in the last few months, maybe Livia was right, and he should have died in upstate New York. So it doesn't have much of a plot. However, I knew I wanted to write about being a parent, and I knew I wanted to write about two siblings, and I knew I wanted to write about happiness and unhappiness. And that had, as I suggested in the talk, had partly to do with thinking quite a bit, particularly after the death of my mum, about such things in the family I grew up in, and it also had to do with being a father and actually seeing the aforementioned daughter at a certain point in her life when she was about 12 go through a number of crises that I'm happy to say she's come through. But at the time, those of you with this sort of experience will know it hits you very hard, and you begin to think about what has been brought into the world without particularly your control, it seems, and then also what little effect one can have, despite all the best intentions as a parent, when it comes to something as mysterious as happiness or just equilibrium. Well, thank you very much indeed.